All right, good morning, everybody. This is Dawn Fluharty, and today I'm going to be doing about a 30-minute presentation on the California tree diseases. We've had a lot more issues this year with diseases, and so I thought it was pretty pertinent to actually sit down and clarify some of the issues we're seeing and some of the calls we're getting. So some of these are common diseases, things that we see all the time, but this year has been particularly unfortunate for fire blight. So what I want to review with fire blight is the fact that it comes out in early spring. If you're going to be doing a tree injection treatment for it, you really need to be doing your injections late January, early February. If you miss and the tree is already leafed out, there's a chance you're going to get some breakthrough of the disease and you may still see some dieback. With this particular disease, it likes cold weather. So what happens is usually those first 4 cold months we have, kind of rainy, that's when the disease is doing its damage and spreading, and that's when we start seeing all the dieback. And it's pretty standard. You see that typical dead branch. The leaves remain on the branch. There's sometimes that kind of shepherd's hook they talk about with the branching. But with this particular one, it only really occurs in our early cold months. Once the temperatures warm up, this disease goes dormant. So usually once we start getting into our 70s, we don't really see any continued dieback and death from this disease. Unless, of course, you're out on the coast and we kind of get those really kind of cold April months, May months. Sometimes it persists a little bit longer than we see in the inland areas. The reason why I want to make this very clear is because we've gotten a lot of calls of people saying they're seeing fire blight in June and July. And fire blight does not exist once we start getting into our warm temperatures. It goes dormant. It doesn't continue to spread and cause dieback in the tree. We're actually seeing another disease come in these warmer temperatures. But before I get into that next disease, I want to make sure that the treatment timing is clear for fire blight. It is an annual treatment because it only suppresses the disease. And so since we're only suppressing the disease, that means every year you don't want it to spread and cause dieback. You have to do the treatment. So we tend to say, wait till flowering or bud expansion. You really don't want to wait until complete leaf out to do your injection of Arbor OTC. And usually one injection will last through the season and we'll be fine. The chemical itself is only really active in the tree for about 4 months. So that's why timing is kind of key on this one. You don't want to get in really early and do your applications in December or something because you want to make sure the chemical's in there while the disease is actually active. So for us, that's usually, late January, February, March, April. Sometimes it can kind of push into May. So that is fire blight. That is very common. We tend to see it on our pears. We'll see it on crab apples. It's amazing. Some people are actually starting to say they're seeing it on other types of trees. I wait for a confirmation from tissue testing. Just because for us it is most commonly on pears, and though it does get into the apple family, it's not common to see it on other types of trees such as sycamores or something. So we tend to run into a different disease at that point. So if you have any questions on fire blight, please feel free to type them in, and we'll get those answered towards the end. One last thing I want to mention with fire blight, though, is when you do the injection to suppress the disease, it does stop the spread and it does stop the dieback. However, if your customer does not prune out your dead prior to your application, that remaining dead tissue on the tree, don't laugh, we have this happen a lot, does not come back to life. What I mean by this is a lot of times customers will go out there and see the dead from the previous year and say, hey, your application didn't work. They don't really have the ability sometimes to differentiate between last year's dieback and this year's dieback. So I always recommend that if you are going to be doing an application for this particular disease, to recommend to the customer prior to your spring application to have the dead pruned out of the trees. And you can make them aware of the correct pruning practices of cleaning the equipment between each cut and making sure they cut far enough back on the branch so the disease is completely removed. But honestly, it's very difficult to get homeowners to do it correctly, and even some arborists and tree companies have a hard time cleaning between each cut, because some trees are just so infested. So those are definitely good candidates for treatment. Okay, so moving on to the next one, that is probably the second most common disease issue in California, and that's Sycamore Anthracnose. It's actually really hard to find a sycamore in California that doesn't have anthracnose. We all kind of look at it. We're all used to the trees having it. Sometimes we treat for it if the customer really wants us to, but sometimes we just say, hey, that's what sycamores have. Well, you can do an injection of phosphorus or propofol in the fall to protect trees against anthracnose. If you wait till spring, you do see a reduced control of the disease, so fall applications are best. And when I say fall, I don't mean, we don't really have a winter here in California. I truly mean fall should be done around October. All applications should be done before the Thanksgiving holiday. So with anthracnose, though, we have noticed that people have a tendency of not noticing the problem until the leaves are already turning brown and dropping off the tree in the summer months. At that point in time, there's no treatment that is going to do anything to really improve the tree. You're better off just getting them on a treatment schedule of fall applications at that time and educate the customer explaining what is happening to the tree. So the disease is already well spread before they actually see the symptoms on the leaves. Anthracnose doesn't just attack the leaves. It can get into the branches as well. You'll see them as small lesions. I just looked at a tree up in Sacramento that had such severe anthracnose that a lot of these small auxiliary twig branches had the lesions and was senescing the branches as well. So that was a pretty severe infection. That was probably going to take a couple years of applications to actually treat and completely get rid of the disease in the tree. And these are annual applications, so it means they probably would have to do an application once for probably about 2 years to really get good control on that one. Most times we'll see a good cleanup of the disease with the fall application. Because there are two different chemicals you can use the phosphorus or the propofol. If you are dealing with western sycamore, I tend to say stick with the phosphorus products. If you're dealing with anthracnose on London plane trees or on oak trees, elm trees, ash trees, pretty much any other tree but the western sycamore, I recommend the propofol. And the reason being is it's more effective on those trees. The western sycamore responds very well to the phosphorus and takes care of the problem and also combats other diseases. So that's kind of the reason why I tend to recommend the phosphorus. So if there's any questions on Sycamore Anthracnose, let me know. I know we're all kind of used to hearing this one all the time, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I really want to get to this new culprit, Botrytis canker. I'm not sure if many of you guys have heard of this. We tend to refer to it as bot canker, less of a mouthful. But this is what we have been seeing a lot more of in the last 3 years. And essentially what it is, it's a canker lesion that occurs on the branch. Usually it will girdle the branch and cause dieback of that branch. Again, the leaves remain on the leaves, and sometimes you can get kind of a shepherd's hook. So when this Botrytis canker gets into pear trees, there's a lot of confusion as to whether it's bot or whether it's fire blight. Well, here's the big difference to tell, is the temperature. Fire blight occurs usually below 70 in our cooler months. Bot canker does not usually show up until we get into our warmer months. June, July, sometimes if we're having a hot May, it might start to show up in May. And so what ends up happening is people who do treatments for fire blight on pear trees get a call back in the warm summer months saying, hey, the treatment failed, I still see fire blight. If you're going back and looking and you see these dead branches, look at the base of the branch, look for this canker, because odds are it's this Botrytis canker. It's occurring in pear trees, it occurs in redwoods, it occurs in sycamores. It's pretty spread throughout our tree population at this point, but you'll kind of notice it in the warmer months. If you really want to identify the difference between, for instance, fire blight and bot canker, go ahead and peel the bark. And the reason why I say that is because you can see that staining in that upper left-hand corner of the disease right where the canker is occurring. Whereas if it's fire blight, you're going to see the disease coming all the way down the branch and stopping and turning green. There's not just going to be a brown canker section right where it's occurring. So that visually you can identify the difference if you go ahead and peel the bark. Unfortunately, this disease is easily overlooked, and so a lot of times that's why I recommend on the western sycamores to use the phosphorus application, because bot canker can be healed by phosphorus. It's a slow process, takes about 6 months, but it can heal up those cankers. So 2 birds, 1 stone. That's the reason why on the Sycamore Anthracnose I say with western sycamore, stay with the phosphorus. If you're dealing with pear trees and you know you have the fire blight and you've had some what they thought was breakthrough of fire blight in the summer, you might want to look at doing in your spring treatment an application of both Arbor OTC for the fire blight and the Arborjet for the bot canker. So it's one of those scenarios. We're seeing more and more of it. We see it in the summer months. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me on this one, because this is starting to create quite a bit of confusion in the industry as to what is happening with these trees and these late summer branch diebacks. All right, moving on to the next one, because this should only be about a 30-minute presentation, and I am quickly falling behind. So everyone has kind of heard of Xylella. We tend to see this in olives. We tend to see this starting to show up in our liquid ambers. And essentially, this one is another vascular infection that unfortunately causes branch dieback. This one in particular is vectored actually by a pest. So in some cases, you can treat for the pest to stop the spread of the disease. But once you see the disease get into the tree, we start seeing the dieback. You can treat for this with Arbor OTC. So a lot of times a dual application of imidacloprid, the Arborjet, and Arbor OTC can help stave off infections of this particular disease. All right, moving on to Fusarium wilt of palms. I know we have this all up and down the state, and the biggest issue I have is making sure everyone identifies it correctly. Fusarium showing up in palms shows up in a very distinct manner. Literally, when you look at a frond, it will die down one side of the frond, go around the tip, and die back the other side of the frond. So you can kind of see that in that center frond in that photo. It's dying down one side, hasn't made the tip and started going back up the other side yet. So it's hard to tell if there's just a bunch of dead fronds on the palm because you can't see the progression of the disease. You want to look for that one frond that's starting to die, and then you can easily identify if it is that disease. It doesn't just hit the Canarelli island palms. It will also get into the Washingtonias. It's a little bit different in how it presents. As you can see in the bottom left there, it starts on one side of the frond and then kind of just works its way all the way across to the other side. It's very distinct. So what we do to actually help hold off this disease are phosphorus injections. You want to maintain the palm health, so you want to make sure it has its full breadth of micronutrients. So you want to make sure you keep going on with your applications of nutrients. However, do try and stay away from high nitrogen. We don't want to cause any added stress to the palm. But by alternating and doing applications of phosphorus and nutrients, we can actually get these trees or palms maintained during this infection. If the infection is too far progressed and you don't have enough of the fronds left in the top of the palm, those are kind of hard to hang on to. You want to catch this early and try and maintain it for as long as you can after that point. But this is not curative. Kind of like our fire blight treatments, they're not curative. They only suppress the disease. That is the same thing that's happening with Fusarium in the palms. All right. Okay. So Rhizospharia, needle cast. We're seeing more and more of this, and a lot of times it's kind of misidentified. People tend to just say it's blight. And I have to admit, I'll tell you right now, every time someone says to me the plant has blight, I kind of cringe because it means we don't know what's going on, and we have to do a little detective work and figure out what it is. So a lot of times when you're dealing with this particular needle cast, you'll notice it more towards the base of the tree, and you'll kind of notice it in the older needles. And there'll be somewhat of a purpling effect usually to them, and they progress up through the tree. And so literally it's needle cast. They're dropping their older needles. When we start to see this occur, you can do an actual tissue test to find out if what's going on, or you can send me a photo. I love those too. You guys know it. So contact me. We can help identify. Diseases are the most difficult thing to really put your finger on and identify correctly, and finding the right chemical to treat it. So never hesitate to reach out and ask questions. This one in particular we treat with propofol, and we can actually get the trees to recover pretty nicely from it. The other one that looks pretty similar to it is the Diplodia tip blight. So this one, a lot of times actually, if you're not familiar with it, can get mistaken for bark beetle attack, because you see random kind of dead branches. But the trick is, it's not the entire branch that dies. It's usually just the tip of the branch. So usually if it's bark beetle, the whole branch in that area dies, not just the tip. So that's one way you can kind of identify the difference. Once again, this is a fungal infection, and we actually see this one more out in our rural landscapes, where the needlecast, we actually tend to see that a little more in our urban landscapes. So kind of keep your eye out for this one. Once again, it's the propofol for treatment. This one you really have to get on and treat quickly. As you can see in that center photo, the disease you can see is pretty much spread throughout the entire tree. Those infections, once that advanced, can be very difficult to control. So once you start seeing it, that's when you want to get your treatments. You don't want to wait for fall, or spring, whenever the best time is to try and inject our conifers. You want to get the treatment going as quickly as possible. All right. Now, Phytophthora canker. This one is another fungal infection. We see it in a lot of our blue spruces, not Colorado blue spruce. We also see it a lot in our redwood trees. And so here's the issue with this one particular one. Notice when you first look at the trees, it looks like it's kind of branches nestled deep inside. We have a lot of issues with this particular canker because it likes the interior branches more of the tree, so you don't notice it right away. You don't really notice it until all of a sudden your tree is really kind of thinning out. A lot of times people will then kind of lift the skirt thinking that maybe they're just, wasn't enough sunlight getting in there or something along those lines. But it actually is a type of Phytophthora canker. On redwood trees, you can see it very distinctly. Look at the branches. You'll see the discoloring of that kind of lesion or canker area. With this one, we like to use the phosphorus product. If you'll kind of notice a general theme here, anytime we're dealing with cankers, we tend to go to phosphorus. Anything that tends to be a more virulent fungal infection, we tend to go to propofol. Okay, rusts. Western gall rust is probably the most common one we see here. There's other ones, the white pine blister rust. But if you've ever looked into a pine tree and you've seen what looks like a cankerous growth on a branch, that is actually, for us mainly, it's the western gall rust. And what will end up happening is eventually that canker will surround the entire branch, girdle the branch, and the branch dies. This is actually spread very easily by spores. So once you get this into a tree, you need to react pretty quickly. If you see just 2 or 3 of these rust formations, you can prune them out. Then you're going to want to treat the tree with the phosphorus. Basically then just get it start protecting itself from any further infections. If your tree unfortunately has hundreds of these galls starting to form, odds are you're not going to be able to prune it out without completely losing the entire tree. So that tree really is a candidate for removal, especially if you have other pines in the area, because you don't want it to infect the surrounding trees. So just be aware of this one. It's not terribly common, but when it creeps up in an area, it can really do a pretty good job of infesting. And unless you get on top of it quickly, it'll definitely take out the tree and can take out surrounding trees. So western gall rust. And again, if you have any suspicions of what this might be, you think you might have it, feel free to send me a photo and I can help you identify it. All right, sudden oak death. Yes, this one's mainly Northern California and now Central California. Someday I am sure it will be in Southern California as well. The trick with this one in particular is once you get it into an area, it really infests the area. People don't quite realize Oops. I think someone might need to hit mute. There we go. So essentially with this particular disease, once it gets into an area, because it likes the rangeland areas, it can really spread quickly. It does prefer the tan oaks, and it is vectored mainly by bay trees. So if you don't have a lot of bay trees or tan oaks, it probably won't vector as quickly for you. However, we are seeing more of it creeping up in the East Bay. We're seeing it spread further south. And we're seeing it spread not just by the standard vectors we know of. We're seeing it actually being vectored on rhododendrons and things of that nature. So be aware of this one. The symptoms tend to show like there's water marking on the leaves. You always kind of get that canker or bleeding or weeping. They're usually in the bottom 3 feet of the trunk of the tree. And there's actually kind of an odor to it. So, yeah, smell the tree. I know. But don't necessarily jump to any conclusions. We do have over like 300 different types of Phytophthora out there. Sudden oak death is just one of them. So, you might want to do a tissue test before hitting the panic button. It might just be one of our standard, infections. The nice part is it's the phosphorus, the Arborjet, that will treat all the Phytophthora infections. So if you have a tree that already shows cankers and lesions and it's showing decline, the odds of you saving that tree are not good. This infection kills trees rather quickly once it gets in there. It's really hard to stop. So once you identify it on a property, you really want to be treating the surrounding trees. Right now, the recommendation is doing a trunk injection in fall. That's a good preventative time to do it. That's when the trees are kind of waking up, coming out of their dormancy, starting to move their vascular tissue. So we get out usually around October to do our injections. And with that, if you have a tree that's already infected, your survival rate is only about 25%. But when you start protecting the surrounding trees, the rate goes up above 75 of what we can say those just with preventative injections. And the injections are done every other year, as opposed to spray applications, which are still recommended by UC Berkeley as an every year application. All right, so that is sudden oak death. And by the way, please remember, this spreads so incredibly easily that if you're working on a site where it does exist, odds are you're going to vector it to the next site. So just be very aware of that. Clean all your equipment, clean your shoes, everything that gets on that site you're going to want to clean off. They did a study basically of people coming off of a sudden oak death infested site, and everything from the tires on the truck to the cell phones all had oomycete spores on them. So that is just something to kind of keep in mind, that it does vector that easily, and you need to make sure you clean all your equipment as thoroughly as possible. All right. Dutch elm disease. This is not one that we hear of very often anymore. It was big in the 80s, but guess what? It's starting to rear its ugly head again. So it is vectored by a beetle, but it also can be vectored from tree to tree by root grass and things of that nature. This disease has been out of the public eye long enough that I've gotten phone calls of people saying, hey, I have an elm tree that looks like it has fire blight. Well, it's not fire blight. It is actually the Dutch elm disease, but it has that same branch dieback that has that hooking and has the leaves hanging on to the branch. So once you identify that on an elm tree, start doing your due diligence. Identify the tree, see if there's any surrounding elm trees. You have to start treating on an annual basis with the propiconazole. And you may want to treat for the vectoring beetle as well if you have a lot of elms in the area, which means you'd be doing a combination treatment of triage and propazole. This, unfortunately, is one of those diseases that once you get it, you're going to continually be fighting it in an area. It is very hard to get rid of. It will get into, like I said, the roots. So if you do have a bunch of elms in an area, one has it, you need to start actually going through and actually cutting the roots so they're not vectoring from tree to tree. There's an entire protocol written up by the UC system on how to deal with Dutch elm disease. But probably the biggest progress we've made in the last, 5-10 years is going from that macro injection of Arborjet, that big 55-gallon drum we'd hook up to the elms, to the micro injection of the propazole. So it does make treatment easier, but it is still something that you have to pay attention to and stay on top of. Okay, thousand cankers disease. This one hasn't really hit the radar too much, mainly for the fact that it's only in black walnuts really at this time. We don't have that many black walnuts, usually in large areas. It's one tree here, one tree there. Tree dies, nobody thinks too much of it. But this particular disease is vectored by a beetle, Arborjet beetle, and it is called the thousand cankers disease because this beetle vectors in a disease that causes a silver dollar-sized canker upon attack. And what happens is you get mass attacks, all those cankers coalesce, and they eventually girdle a branch and eventually girdle the tree. That's why it's called thousand cankers disease. This disease does have the ability to get into our agricultural industry. It will show up in our walnuts. So it is something that they are working on treating. UC Davis is doing the main research. So far in non-edibles, we found that the triage and propofol work well, though we have found some phytotoxicity in warm temperatures. So we've always recommended a fall application against this disease. But the trick is, once again, if you see a black walnut and you see a dead branch, your mind should first go to thousand cankers disease. It only takes about 6 months, maybe a year, for this pest to really kill this tree. And so it moves quickly, and it takes people a while to identify it. So it can move through an area pretty quickly. All right. Mountain pine beetle. I know I'm talking about a beetle, not a disease, but the reason why I'm talking about this particular beetle is because it does vector a disease called blue stain fungus. Blue stain fungus can kill a tree pretty much as well as the beetle can kill a tree. We were not seeing a whole lot of it here in California initially, 3 to 5 years ago, but once our bark beetle infestation has gotten out of control, blue stain was introduced, mainly by the mountain pine beetle, but now other beetles have started to vector it as well, so we're seeing a much larger presence of blue stain fungus in our trees. So I know if you get up to the Groveland area, Sonora area, it's pretty much hard to see a cut tree that doesn't have blue stain fungus. You get up into the Tahoe area, Lake Arrowhead area, we don't have a whole lot of blue stain fungus. So it does seem to be in certain areas, but the beetles do have the ability to vector it. So kind of keep that in mind. It's one of those situations where when we first start seeing beetles attack, we tend to treat with triage. But once we start seeing more and more trees dying from the blue stain fungus and we see a higher presence of the blue stain fungus, then we start treating the trees with both the triage and, again, the propofol to combat the disease. And really, with blue stain fungus, you really want to get the chemical, the fungicide in the tree prior to it being introduced. Once in there, it's hard to stop. It works much better as a preventative. So if any of you guys are dealing with bark beetles, keep your eye out for this disease. You can see it's very distinct. It has blue-black staining out in that xylem tissue. And it can girdle the tree, as you see in that photo in the bottom. All right, last couple beetles that vector diseases that I'm going to talk about is the Polyphagous shot-hole borer. Yes, this is mainly in Southern California, but it's made it up to Central California. And it's kind of that same idea where the beetle is bringing in the disease. Right now, it's mainly bringing in Fusarium and Graphium, Fusarium being the more virulent of the two. And honestly, the argument early on was, are the beetles killing the tree or is the disease killing the tree? Well, really, it boils down to both. You puncture a tree's vascular tissue so many times, it can no longer translocate the water, and therefore it dies of drought. The disease actually gets in there and helps speed up the process by basically clogging up the vascular tissue and therefore girdling the tree and the tree dying, basically a drought symptom. So with this one in particular, yes, the disease is a significant factor because that is what the beetles feed off of. And the one thing I will mention with this, I know a lot of you guys have heard a lot about shot-hole borer. I have done a lot of presentations on shot-hole borer. I can send you research on shot-hole borer. But the biggest thing we have to keep in mind is Arborjet beetles really don't feed on the tree. They just bore into the tree and then plant that fungus that they bring, and they feed on the fungus. So when it comes to treating this particular beetle, we have to make sure we're going at the high rate of the triage, ivermectin benzoate, so that way it incidentally gets the chemical. If we let that chemical rate drop down to low levels, the rate of incidence drops dramatically, and it's hard to kill the beetle. So therefore, you always want to make sure you're going at the high rate if the pest is already present in the tree. You can drop back to the medium rate if you're doing preventative work, but honestly, you want to make sure you're always dealing with the high rate when you're dealing with ambrosia beetles. All right. Okay, the last beetle that I'm going to talk about that vectors disease is the Kuroshio shothole borer, which now, if you've kept up with all that's going on in Southern California, they gave up calling them Kuroshio and Polyphagous shothole borer, and they now just call it the invasive shothole borer, which kind of added more confusion out through the industry, but we're all trying to keep up. So essentially what it is, it's the same thing. This beetle is identical to the Polyphagous shothole borer, except for at a DNA level. So far, the diseases they vector have been found to be the same, but there is a chance that the Polyphagous shothole borer has one more disease that it carries than the Kuroshio. Either way, it's still that mass attack. Either way, we're still dealing with an ambrosia beetle that we have to use the high rate of insecticide to combat. And once you start getting them in the tree, you automatically have to start treating with the fungicide as well. So I know there's probably still a lot of questions on this particular pest and disease, so feel free, contact me afterwards, and I can get you up to speed on that pest. So quickly, I just want to review the chemical controls I mentioned. Arborjet, this is the one we tend to use on things like western Sycamore Anthracnose, Phytophthora, pine pitch canker. Anything that's got canker in the name, odds are you're going to be using the phosphorus product. It basically works by, stimulating the tree's own immune system. So it's going to be a slow response. Remember, our trees don't grow as fast as we like them to sometimes. And so since we're basically waiting for the tree's health to respond, it is a slow process. So usually we see results in a longer time period. That's the reason why we always do fall applications usually with this product. The other one I spoke on is the propazole or the propiconazole product. This one is more of a fungistat, which means it more attacks the disease. And so we tend to use it on more virulent things such as blue stain fungus, Fusarium, Geosmithia, things of that nature. Arbor OTC is the antibiotic. This one is the one we use on fungal infections. Keep in mind, when dealing with a fire bite fungal infection, you're going to be doing an early spring application. If you're dealing with things like Xylella, that is when you're probably going to get more into the late spring, possibly early summer. So this one is a time-sensitive application. The chemical is only really active inside the tree for about 4 months. So be sure to water your tree in. We've had instances where during our droughts, trees didn't have access to water. If they don't have access to water, they can't move their vascular system, which means they can't move the chemical. So be sure that when you use this product in particular, that the tree is watered well, so that way it has plenty of water to actually move the chemicals to the tree in the quickest manner possible. And then one way to actually help stimulate getting the tree to move some of these chemicals is by actually watering in with NutriRoots or something like NutriRoots. And basically what it does is it gets the tree to respond. NutriRoots specifically holds the water in the root zone of the tree, so that way it's always available for the tree. But also by having the kelp and some of the microbes in there, it helps stimulate the tree to start actively taking up. So especially if I'm dealing with something time sensitive, I always recommend doing the NutriRoot application. If we're going into the dry months, so usually at the end of May, I start saying applications of NutriRoot are key if you're going to be doing any applications, because the tree is going to need that water to uptake during those summer months when it's drier. So always a good thing to add. And then there's now our Eco 1 product, which I'm going to talk about cursory. It's kind of new. It's a combination of insecticide and fungicide. It's a topical 25B product, which means it does not require EPA registration, and it's made from plant extracts. So this product is great when you're dealing with that one yard that's just infested everywhere with aphids or whitefly or what have you. You can pretty much spray down the entire yard with this product. So let me know if you have any questions on it. It's new to our market. We just launched it here at the beginning of the year. So if you want some samples or have some ideas of trying it out, go ahead and give me a contact, and I'll work on you with that as well. And lastly is Shortstop. I think this is something you guys have probably heard of before. It's a tree growth regulator. Essentially what it is we apply it as a soil drench around the base of the tree. You do it once every 2 years, and essentially it reduces the internodes between the leaves, and so it shortens and holds your canopy while redirecting that energy down to the roots. So during our drought, that's key. We want to stop the growth of the canopy and focus on the roots so the tree can find water. But in this, we found some other, let's just say, advantageous properties to it. So what we noticed is if you look at the leaves, they actually become smaller with a darker, thicker cuticle. And when we get that darker, thicker cuticle, we found that topical infections such as things like powdery mildew have a harder time taking hold. So we actually have some research working with powdery mildew and cytospora canker on reducing infections and lesions by using this short-stop product. This is a tree growth regulator. It is not registered as a fungicide at this point in time. These are just extra observations we have made and found research on. We will be pursuing it further and getting more research on it and seeing what other applications it has that are fungicidal properties. But in the meantime, I just want to point this out to you guys. It's kind of an interesting effect. So we're doing more research on sycamore trees. I tend to get a lot of powdery mildew. So holding that canopy and developing the roots and reducing the infections of powdery mildew. So that is my quick half-hour-long presentation on California tree diseases. I know it was a lot of information, so if you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I'm here to be a resource for you. So that is all of my contact information. So feel free to reach out, send photos, and use me as you need to. Thank you very much.